built this city. We built this city on rock and roll. We built this city. We built this city on rock and roll. Well, cities were growing back in the late 1800s into the 1900s. This lecture today discussion is Chapter 18, The Gilded Age. And when we look at politics back at that time, we'll talk about a little bit about that and many of the immigrants that came to America during the latter half of the 19th century. Most people between about 1876 to 1900 voted Republican. Almost every president that won the presidency during the last quarter of the century was a Republican. Cleveland slipped in there twice as a Democrat, but other than that, it was pretty much Republican dominated. 1892, Weaver ran as a populist and didn't really make that much of an impact on the election, but it was pretty much, like you say, a Republican-dominated era during the Gilded Age, which lasted from about 1877 to 1900. The rich got richer during this time, and there were many social problems that we'll get into when we talk about progressivism down the road. But you had a lot of poor immigrants living in cities, and you had many farmers that moved into cities to get jobs and left the farmland. They often ended up living in tenement housing in big cities, which was a very small apartment. Sometimes several different families would share that apartment. There might be a light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and a community bath or shower in the basement with cold water. Very uncomfortable place to have to live in crowded conditions. And people started really being concerned about the immigrant and the poor immigrant problem that we had in cities at that time. One of those was Jane Addams, who I guess today we call her a social worker. She was in Chicago, and she set up, organized what was called a settlement house to help poor immigrants, and they provided educational services and social services and things like that. Many of the people who lived here didn't like the immigrants coming in. They felt they took their jobs. They were willing to work for lower wages, which of course sounds familiar compared to today. Many of these immigrants who came from southern and eastern Europe were willing to take those jobs, and they wanted to come to America just like most immigrants do today for a better life. But the people back here in the United States that were opposed to this were called nativists. They felt that America belonged to the Americans, and we had enough immigration as it was. We talked in the last chapter about how the AFL wanted to get the work week down to 40 hours, and that left a lot of, well, let's just say a little more extra time for recreation for people, because they weren't always working from 6 in the morning till 6 at night, 6 days a week. So you had different things that came up to amuse and entertain people. One of those was the idea of amusement parks with rides and sideshows and freak shows and that sort of thing. Baseball was becoming a big deal by the turn of the century, and many people in America, including immigrants, followed baseball. College football was a big thing, and which was, of course, professional football really hadn't gotten a big hold on things yet. And many people went to vaudeville shows, which was a kind of a variety show for the people. We also had traveling circuses. You look at probably the biggest one at that time was Barnum and Bailey, and eventually they're going to merge with the Ringling Brothers. But Barnum, of course, created what was called the greatest show on earth, and two of his biggest stars, and one wasn't very big at all. He was actually 3 feet tall. He was Tom Thumb was his name, and his stage name anyway. Charles Stratton was his real name, and they claimed that he was 36 inches tall, the shortest man in the world. And Then he got married to a woman who was about an inch shorter than him, and lived happily ever after. They say it was called the wedding of the century by some people. The other star of Barnum's circus was an elephant named Jumbo, which is where we got the term jumbo popcorn, jumbo pop or soda, jumbo hot dogs, jumbo everything. And Jumbo was called the largest elephant in the world. They found him in a London zoo after being taken from an African jungle. And to get him over here, they gave him, well, actually, they got him drunk on beer. And he came across the ocean, nothing like a drunk elephant on a ship, that's for sure. So once they got him here and he woke up, he was part of the circus. Unfortunately for Jumbo, in the end, he ended up dying tragically. He was actually standing on a railroad track, and a train hit him and killed him. But up until that point, Jumbo was quite a sensation. One of the other stars that was around this time was a guy named Martin Laurello. Its last name is Laurello, and he was called the Human Owl. If you ever get a chance, look him up on YouTube. I'm sure he's a little more exciting than my videos. Well, maybe not. But Martin Laurello, the Human Owl. Also during this time we talked a little bit about the immigrants and working in factories, and the last chapter I mentioned Gompers in the AFL, and not every worker was happy. They were still fighting for better wages, etc. And the steel plant, Carnegie Steel Plant at Homestead in Pennsylvania, went on strike. Henry Frick was Carnegie's business partner while Carnegie was going back in Scotland on vacation, and his workers went on strike, and it was a pretty big deal. People got killed, dynamite was thrown, and it turned out to be a big mess for Carnegie to have to deal with later. Also, you had a fellow named Jacob Coxey, 1893. Coxey, one of the effects of the Panic of '93, which they called depressions back then, panics, was that people had a difficult time finding a job. Many people had to work, had to find a job, had a difficult time finding employment. And in fact, the unemployment rate in many places was as high as 25%. And Coxey led a march from Ohio to Washington, D.C. to try to get the government to do something. Of course, what he was wanting is the government to provide jobs for people. Unfortunately, he wanted to get 10,000 people with him on the march, but only a few hundred showed up. And he ended up getting arrested for walking on the White House lawn, and that was the end of Coxey's march to try to get the government to provide work for people. Couple final thoughts to think about. One is when it comes to immigration, and this is something we deal with even today, how do we decide who gets into the country first? Is it people that, doctors and lawyers and people that make a lot of money and provide a service for people, or is it those that come from war-torn areas that are in danger of their life if they stay behind? Another question to think about is that we moved at this time from a rural to a urban area as far as movement and migration of people. For those of you that lived in the rural or country area before, do you like it better than the city? What's some of the advantages of city life versus country life? One more thing to think about too is we often see immigration today when immigrants come here, and we find that first generation immigrants, when they come from their country of origin, they can speak the language, read the language, write the language. Then they have a kid who's born in the United States, and they can often do two of those three things. And then the third generation, quite often, they can't do any of those. They can't speak it, they can't read it, they can't write it. think about your own family and have they had that experience here? And certainly, unless you make a conscious effort, it's probably difficult to keep the language and the culture in the family. One more thing to think about too is touched on baseball and how that was popular with the people. Is baseball still America's favorite pastime, or has the luster of baseball kind of disappeared in America? And why, or why not? I mentioned Coxey, who marched for jobs. Is it the government's job to create jobs? And how do they do that? Do they do that by doing what Roosevelt did during the New Deal and have work programs where you're working for the government on road projects and bridges and schools and airports? Or do you cut taxes to businesses so they can hire more people and expand themselves? Or do you do a little bit of both? Or is there another way that the government creates jobs or should create jobs? And the final thought I want to mention is that we were talking about Jumbo and the elephants in the circus. Recently, there's been the Barnum and Bailey has decided to not have any more elephants at circuses because of the bad treatment of elephants. Any thoughts on that? Something to think about as we close out today.